Hi everyone. Hope you enjoyed. That was Sunny with Frank Sinatra and Duke Ellington. I'm Bruce Moravchik, and this is the October NOAA Climate Stewards webinar. This evening, we've got two very special guests that I'm particularly excited to have join us, Dr. Krista Heiser and Dr. Wendy Kuntz from the University of Hawaii at, I'm going to get this right, Kapiolani Community College, and they're going to be offering us a presentation teaching the science and rhetoric of climate change, strategies, pitfalls, and keeping your head above water in turbulent times. We're beginning right now, and of course, we have a little bookkeeping to go through before we begin our presentation. And stay tuned afterwards, we have some very special announcements. To begin, tonight's broadcast is being recorded, and we are going to send you a link to a video archive within a week. Now, if you don't receive a link to the archive or an email, send me an email with the subject, request link to the October 2017 webinar. Now, a video archive and all the slides presented here tonight and for previous broadcasts going back to 2013 are available on the NOAA Climate Stewards Google website. Now, if you can't access this site, you can send an automatic access request through Google, or you can email me with the subject, request access to CSEP Google site. Please note, you will have to have a Google account in order to set up to access the site. For those of you who are with us for the entire period of the broadcast, we will be sending you out a certificate of attendance acknowledging that you have participated in one contact hour of professional development with our presenters. As with all of our webinars, your microphones are going to be muted during the broadcast. If you'd like to ask a question to either of our presenters, to myself or one of the other NOAA Climate Steward staff, please type it into your GoToWebinar control panel. And during tonight's broadcast, you're going to receive an email with a link to a post-webinar poll. We really appreciate your prompt response. It's going to provide us with essential metrics and is going to help us prepare for future events. Speaking of future events, our next webinar is going to take place on Monday, November 6th at 7:30 p.m. Eastern Time. The focus is going to be chasing coral, the impact of warming seas on coral ecosystems. And our presenter is going to be Dr. Mark Eakin, Director of NOAA's Coral Reef Watch program. And again, on Monday, November 27th at 8 p.m. Eastern Time, we have our next book club meeting. Our book, Braiding Sweetgrass, Indigenous Wisdom, Scientific Knowledge, and the Teachings of Plants by Robin Wall Kimmerer, is going to be led by Peg Steffen. If you'd like to join the discussion group, you should contact her directly. Or look out for an email from me. I'll be sending out an announcement about it. Now finally, and this is a big announcement, and I can answer questions on this later, and there will be more information coming out about this, Climate Stewards is becoming, I wish I had a drum roll or something, NOAA Planet Stewards. If you are not signed up to our email list for Climate Stewards, you should sign up today. The link is here below, and it's also on our current NOAA Climate Stewards website. Now, the focus of NOAA Planet Stewards is going to, in fact, be expanding on what we do with NOAA Climate Stewards. We're going to be focusing on providing knowledge and resources to build a scientifically literate individuals as well as communities that are prepared to respond to the environmental challenges monitored by NOAA. So we're going to be going beyond just climate. We're going to be looking at many things that NOAA monitors, such as marine debris, non-point source pollution, extreme weather, things of this nature, as well as other things that are impacting ecosystems. And we're also going to be supporting participants in the development and implementation of projects involving behaviors that conserve, restore, and protect human communities and natural resources relating to NOAA's mission. Lots of information is going to be going out up on the website soon, as well as in emails. And if you're signed up for our email list, you can apply to be part of our stewardship community and receive up to $2,500 for a classroom, school, or community project, as well as find out about upcoming webinars, book clubs, workshops, lots of different professional development opportunities, and education resources. Well, that's exciting. What I'd like to do now is I'd like to turn the screen over to Drs. Heiser and Kuntz, and I'd like to introduce them if I may. Well, Dr. Krista Heiser is a professor of composition and rhetoric at Kapiolani Community College, where she team teaches a biology and English learning community course, Decade Zero, Understanding the Science and Rhetoric of Climate Change, with Dr. Wendy Kuntz. She has published on community engagement, service learning, organizational change, post-apocalyptic, and cli-fi literature. She's a recipient of the Board of Regents Award for Excellence in Teaching and the University of Hawaii President's Award for Leadership in Sustainability. Currently serving as the University of Hawaii's System Sustainability Curriculum Coordinator, Dr. Heiser's work is to facilitate change management, coordinate sustainability across the curriculum, and facilitate interdisciplinary dialogue and professional development opportunities for faculty to update and transform their courses. Dr. Heiser has an MA in English Composition and Rhetoric from San Francisco State University and a PhD in Educational Administration from the University of Hawaii. Her dissertation, Sustainability, Perspectives of Students as Stakeholders in the Curriculum, focused on higher education for sustainable development. Now, Dr. Wendy Kuntz is Associate Professor of Biology and Ecology at Kapiolani Community College and is faculty on the college's Science, Technology, Engineering, and Math program. She's active in promoting pedagogies to support STEM education and science communication. She's trained as a research scientist with a PhD from the University of Hawaii, focused on the breeding biology of one of Hawaii's iconic forest birds. I hope it's the EEV that I have a picture of for later on in the presentation. She is accomplished in designing undergraduate service and research projects that engage students in environmental science by connecting them to their communities. Dr. Kuntz is a recipient of the Board of Regents Award of Excellence in Teaching and an active member of the Hawaii team for the NSF-funded Science Education for New Civic Engagements and Responsibility program. As I mentioned earlier, she team teaches the Biology and English Learning Community course, Decade Zero, Understanding the Science and Rhetoric of Climate Change with Dr. Krista Heiser. And Dr. Kuntz has developed and serves at the faculty as the faculty director of the Kai-Yama program, an international collaboration between Kapiolani Community College and Kansai University in Japan that examines environmental science solutions. At the campus level, Dr. Kuntz is a leader in integrating sustainability across the curriculum and currently serves as chair of the Faculty Senate Sustainability Committee. She's presented at national conferences on course redesign to engage students in science learning and provided training for faculty on ways to incorporate sustainability and climate change into their courses. And with no further ado, you all have the floor. Welcome, Drs. Heiser and Dr. Kuntz.
Aloha.
Aloha. Thank you,
Hello.
Bruce. We want to shorten our bios or maybe do less things. I don't know. Welcome, everybody, to the webinar. The last time that Wendy and I presented this material was at a environmental educators symposium here in Hawaii. It's where we met Bruce. And it was the last day of the meeting. We'd had a keynote from Hawaii's top climatologist talking about climate change impacts in Hawaii, kind of an update. The meeting was very similar to today's community. There were a lot of informal educators, K-12 teachers, and community college professors. And after this keynote address, we thought that everybody was done and they wouldn't be coming to our 4:30 p.m. session. But in fact, it was packed. And the session was supposed to be only 30 minutes long, but people stayed for like an hour and a half.
They went into our pauhana, which in Hawaii is basically your time for beer.
So it was just really clear that teachers of all kinds, all levels, want to know more about how to teach more effectively with what you already know.
Yeah, I think what really resonated with the group was that Krista was talking about communicating from a very different perspective from the rest of us that were mostly scientists or environmental educators. Krista was the only English teacher. You were the only. Everyone's really hungry for strategies about how to communicate climate change, and understanding rhetoric is an important part of that.
Yeah. So Bruce, I think this would be a great time to run the who's in the room kind of question. I'd like to know what people teach and at what level, and a little bit about your disciplinary background. While the poll's running, I just think that every science teacher should have a buddy from the social sciences or the humanities field. And I know that when I started going to science meetings, and they said, "What are you doing here, English teacher?" I said, "You guys shouldn't have to do this all by yourself. I feel like you science teachers are carrying too big of a burden." And I go to many national meetings and I talk about this, and it's really where the discussion is at. How can we expand climate education across the disciplines so that the rest of us teachers are helping scientists communicate this, and so that we are getting a more multifaceted perspective on this question of how do we prepare students for the future that they will inherit. It's not just what skills and concepts they learn in our classes, but how do we model for them different ways of thinking and being and doing, and how do we work as a teaching community to promote hope and self-efficacy and resilience.
So it's really important for...
Did the poll results come in, Bruce?
Yes. Can you see them on your screen?
No.
Well, if you cannot, then it looks like 20% of our attendees are elementary or middle school teachers, 13% are high school educators, 15% are in community college or four-year universities as educators, 34% are informal educators, and 18% are professional development providers to educators.
Fascinating. Thank you very much.
Yeah. So we're going to give an overview of our course, and it's a very, one of the great parts about having two instructors from different aspects, from the English side, from the science side, is that our students really get to see this interchange between faculty. And I know for me it was a little like going back to school and going back and learning some of the communication techniques that I probably was introduced to as an undergraduate but had forgotten. So it was also a chance to get to reading that in my trial. I got to be a student in English class and read Barbara Kingsolver's Flight Behavior book, which was really cool.
I love this book, Flight Behavior. The way the main character falls in love with the scientist who comes out to investigate the butterfly phenomenon. She falls in love with the scientist, but I think really she's falling in love with science. And I think, Wendy, reading that book with the students in our class, I think you converted at least 3 of our female students into science, don't you?
Well, they were all mostly first year. When we first taught this class, it was all first-year students, so they were all freshmen, and many of them hadn't decided where they were going. But it was really great to have them be able to connect the science learning with an ability to communicate, and hey, I actually could be a scientist. Things like reading Barbara Kingsolver's book kind of opened up different ways of how science works and who a scientist is. Some of our students became avid bird watchers, and one's even president of the Ecology Club.
And then there was the guy who came back a year later after our first offering of the course, wanting to change his major from accounting to biology.
Yeah.
So sometimes, I mean, that just shows the resonance of it, and that sometimes we might not be able to measure the learning outcomes of a course like this on the final exam or in the semester, but we really see ripples with these groups of students across campus. So today's agenda, we're going to give you a description of our course, which we call Decade Zero. This, of course, comes from Naomi Klein's work and refers to the urgency of the now as we set and then pass markers like 350 parts per million, the Paris Accord, and how some of this is accelerating faster even than we think. Decade Zero, we think, captures that in a compelling way for students. And we'll talk about learning communities, service learning, and the assessment tool that we use. And then Wendy is going to talk about how she teaches the Earth's energy balance and why it's such a key concept for teaching climate change.
Krista's going to talk about communicating climate change, communication strategies, and then barriers to communication.
Right. And then we're hoping to leave a lot of time at the end for a real talk story, which in Hawaii is how we just share our experiences so that we can create meaning and best practices together out of our experiences. So, sounds good?
So I think we should give an overview of the course. On the screen here we actually have two images. The one on the left is the flyer that we use to advertise the course to students. Right, the poster that Krista and I made, which we'll unpack a little bit as we go through. But I want to just start by kind of going over what a learning community is. So this is where two different disciplines come together, and we have a conversation, and through the lens usually of one topic. So for us it was climate change. In this course, we actually had, I'll just go back a slide, we had two courses, we tried this twice. In both times, students are taking 6 credits. So 3 credits of English 100 and 3 credits of Biology 124, which is an introductory environmental science course. In the first time we did it in 2015, we had the classes back-to-back. And then in 2016, we tried it with the classes with a little bit of separation. I think both of us actually preferred the back-to-back because it gave us a little bit more time with the students.
Right. So I was in Wendy's class. I've taken biology many times now as a student. So I was in Wendy's class and she was in my class. So students got to see us talking with each other frequently. It was great modeling. And then the kind of double block also gave us time for going out on field trips. So we went to the Alawai and we went down to Waikiki, which is about 5 minutes away from our campus, to really look at sea level rise.
Right, and that was a great experience because we got to meet experts from NOAA, and often students will kind of fall into, I want to say, very simple rhetoric where they're like, oh, Waikiki, which is our big tourist hub, is going to be underwater. But the science is actually not showing, that's not exactly accurate in terms of the scientific. It will have impacts and incursions, but it's not going to be 10 feet underwater.
Right. In our class, oops. Oh, so learning communities were a way of embodying some of the things that Dr. Martha Monroe talked about last week. I thought this was a wonderful synthesis that she gave on educational interventions for climate education. So me and Wendy's class is an example of an educational intervention. And the findings from her analysis was And I just love this, that good climate change education is good education. It's just challenging teaching this way. I think we know what we need to do. It's just how can we help each other to do it effectively. And then some more tips that she gave. Our Learning Community course really gave us a chance to do all of these things. The one I asked this list is connecting students to solutions. And that's where for our course Service Learning also was a big component of the course. Students need to see models, role models of people in the community who are working towards solution and addressing these things as part of their daily work. So service learning was a huge thread across both courses, worth credit in both courses. Wendy and I chose 5 different projects, and students worked in groups doing stream monitoring, working with elementary students on the food farm.
In the rain garden on our campus.
Yeah, so they also got another role model with the leader of that service learning project. So that was also very key. And then this discussion group that I show here, this was sort of the structure of my side of the course. I had the Cli-Fi book club, which is where we read the Barbara Kingsolver book. And by the way, last week I learned about a climate generation book club, Cli-Fi book club, and I just joined that one. So ask Bruce about that after the session. The discussion group here is using these Northwest Earth Institute discussion guides that I think are awesome. And they're really useful for a variety of reading levels. I use the book called Change is Our Choice. These books are designed as discussion guides to empower ordinary people to talk about climate change in their communities. So I actually used this as my textbook and as a major assignment in the course, which I'll talk about in a minute.
One of the integrated course in terms of the learning community is that we were aiming to have our students not only know the science of climate change, as from my perspective as an environmental science educator, but also be able to communicate the science of climate change. And so this is some results from the end of the course from our first year, using a student assessment of learning gains in terms of how confident they feel in explaining the science of climate change, and how, maybe more importantly, how confident they feel in communicating that with family and friends. So this was, we felt that all of our students had gains over the course of the semester.
And their own perception of their own gains, which is great. They had a high level of confidence.
So when we started this class, I reorganized the material that is the way I usually present it for an environmental science course. I shifted my course design to the lens of climate change and how I presented material. And the entire course was then presented through this lens. And we started the course and then continued through the course using the global energy balance. And this is a model that the students become very comfortable with, and they can explain it. It's hands-on, and it's a two-dimensional model that represents all of the models in climate change. So students, when we learn about research that's coming from the IPCC, all of these models, it can be a little difficult to grasp for students, but if they start with the two-dimensional and they see the inputs and the outputs for the global energy balance, this allows them to really better grasp the kind of computer modeling data that comes out. I really want students to know this model. I kind of joke that they should be able to draw it on a cocktail napkin by the end, because it becomes a tool for them. So we use the model as a tool. It's a way that they can discuss climate change with other people and avoid getting tripped up, right? Yeah. So sometimes there are people, it's easy to get tripped up when you're talking about climate change, especially ways to mitigate climate change or explaining the causes of climate change. If you have the model in front of you and you can draw it, then you can kind of walk yourself through the process. And it's a real useful tool.
So this is where the light comes in one spectrum. I'm going to give it a try here with my cocktail napkin. And then some of that is absorbed, and then some is reflected with the albedo effect. That's things that are white, like snow and roofs. How am I doing?
You're doing pretty good. But see, this is the advantage. If you've drawn this, now you can walk yourself through it, right? So this is where it gives students the tools to kind of move forward in their missions on it.
It's not just like a blanket?
Well, they can use this model to kind of talk about what the blanket analogy is all about, right?
So the crochet, cotton crochet blanket versus the wool blanket, right?
Yeah.
I'm getting better. I'm getting better. I've really learned a lot. I want to ask you, Wendy, about this. Another webinar that I watched with Dr. Joyce Parker. She said that 12% of first-year students, college freshmen, can give a reasonable explanation of a model or a graph such as this. 12%. Do you think that's good or bad?
Well, I think it's about what I would expect. And that's, I think, if you went to many of our practicing scientists, you know, they still might have a little trouble sometimes, because if you're not using a model every day, you kind of lose track of what the inputs and outputs are. So it's one of the reasons in our class we really kept coming back to the model so they would become comfortable with it. But most of our students coming in have had, you know, just a few years of high school science. And so, you know, this is new to them. And being able to apply that model is a whole nother level.
So if Wendy is teaching this Earth's energy balance, and I am having students form this Northwest Earth Institute discussion group, you can see how these work together. Students are having to explain climate science and talk about solutions, carbon footprint, and things like that with a different group, right? As I'll talk about when I get to communication strategies, explaining something to the person next to you in your class is not nearly as helpful as when you of the boundaries. So, for example, students had to form a discussion group of elementary school children, or a couple students did grandparents or elderly. One group connected with a group of ESOL, second language learners here on campus, and they actually took them hiking and on some outings and explained Earth energy balance to this group of students who are from China. So they got to learn not just about like air quality issues in China, but they got to learn what the Chinese students understood about Earth's energy balance and climate modeling. And that's where I think the breakthroughs come. Not in explaining it to someone in your class, but someone from a different demographic.
So, and to follow up kind of on the science and the conversations, when the students are having conversations with each other, it's really important that they can use their model to identify solutions to climate change. And that's where I think the power of the science can be pulled into the rhetoric, right? So the students can we learn about photosynthesis, we learn about the carbon cycle, they look at how those connect to the Earth's energy balance. And so when you bring up things like the blanket around the Earth of carbon dioxide, you know, how do we make that blanket thicker or thinner, right? How do we reduce the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere? And then they can point to direct solutions using their understanding of what happens in the carbon cycle. And this gives them a lot more confidence when they're discussing the science, and it kind of leaves, hopefully, their conversations with a more solution-oriented rather than kind of just doom and gloom.
They just want to go and plant trees. They're like, look at the science. They say, why aren't we just planting more trees? It seems like an easy solution. So Bruce, I had a question there about what solutions are people teaching, and then that I think helps us to think about how we connect what we're teaching to the solutions that we think are going to work, rather than just presenting a plate of possible ideas. Which ones are we actually moving towards? So Bruce, can you run that question poll?
Absolutely.
Thank you. I really like the Paul Hawkins' new book, Drawdown. It's a beautiful, beautiful book with illustrations, and it takes 100 solutions, climate solutions, and he engaged a whole team of researchers to analyze the cost-benefit analysis and the impacts of 100 different solutions, and then ranking. So I think this could potentially be a great tool in the classroom. You look up a solution, and it's, you know, it's number 6. Educating girls is number 6, and I know that's always one that students are really surprised at how big the impact is. So I like to turn us to looking at solutions in books like that.
Okay, so we have the poll up right now, and please select your top 3 over here, either reducing emissions, decreasing individual carbon footprints, planting trees, reducing deforestation, geoengineering, technological innovations or space exploration, reducing populations, or other. And if you select other, feel free to type in what that other may be in your question panel. We've got about 75% of folks voting. We're just going to leave this open for another moment or so.
And that's also something we can come back to in our talk story at the end. Yeah?
Well, we've closed the poll.
Okay.
And it looks like about 92% of folks focus on reducing emissions, decreasing individual carbon footprints. 67% focus on planting trees, reducing deforestation. 28% geoengineering, technological innovations, space exploration. 35% focus on reducing populations, and 18% on other. And we'll see what that is when they type it into their question panels.
Great, thank you.
So we'll come back to those. I'm going to digest that for a minute, and we'll come back to that. That's a lot of different solutions that we're teaching, and kind of have some where that takes us with all of these different solutions. I want to shift gears and share some of the research on climate communication. As a sort of composition and rhetoric person, this field right now is really hot in terms of climate communication. There's a lot of engagement about how we can teach this and how we can do this better. That climate communication is grounded in neuroscience. So I want us to start by thinking about how our brains work. We're all educators, we're all teachers, so we understand the concept of schema. When we're going to learn something new, first we activate our prior knowledge, and that is the dendrites become activated, and this is how we assimilate new information, by sort of pairing it to the information that's in our minds. So if you have not read Don't Even Think About It, Why Our Brains Are Wired to Ignore Climate Change, this to me is the best starting point. Most of what I understand about climate communication began in this book. It's a really wonderful inquiry. He's basically saying, how can we all know this and yet seem so paralyzed in what to do about it? And it has to do with our brain. We have 2 types of bias. The way the brain wants to absorb and connect information, new information, is kind of confounded by confirmation bias and availability bias. And unfortunately, both of these work against science, and particularly climate information. You know, if it's a perfectly nice day outside, then the information that I'm learning is subject to bias. Doesn't make sense to my cognitive brain, right? Now, in the last couple of weeks, when we're being slammed by multiple hurricanes, suddenly that availability bias changes and people start to maybe pay attention and their brains relax, become a little more open to absorbing, assimilating that information. This is also called cognitive dissonance, how we know one thing and do another thing, how we understand this problem and yet drive a car every day. We all are causing the problem every day, even as we're studying it in an air-conditioned classroom. So it's really cognitively difficult for us. And you all know that drawing attention to an uncomfortable, undesirable idea backfires, and the way our brain wants to deal with that is by just grabbing onto its confirmed available information, the information that feels safe for the brain. It's not the person doing it, it's the physical brain, the neural wiring wants to do that. So I can only imagine with a class of 35 and you're teaching and all this is going on, you know that you probably have students who are recording incorrect information. So that's cognitive science. Then a second way of looking at climate communication comes from classical rhetoric, right? Ethos, logos, and pathos. I think this was the part that Wendy really enjoyed in my class.
Well, having taken English 100 myself many years prior, I probably had forgotten some of these. And so it was really nice to see how well these fit into modern communication of science. And in general, scientists are struggling with how do we communicate. But this is especially clear when we're talking about climate science research.
That's right. And my basic suggestion is to always use at least two at once. The problem that I see scientists having is a problem of ethos right now. It's just a complex ethos to be a scientist. And the way that scientists, what I've seen, the way scientists gain ethos is through developing trust and through being in the field. When Wendy's students are out knee-deep with her in the mud in Mauna Loa Bay, pulling out invasive species and mapping the ocean, she has an incredible ethos as compared to lecturing in the front of the classroom. So I think that ethos is also strengthened by field work, by trust, by consistency, and by repeating your message. Pathos, or audience, has to do with understanding what an individual is afraid of and what they care about. We have two emotions, fear and love. What do people care about and how is it going to be impacted by climate change? And what are people afraid of? And how can we speak to those concerns? So if we use one of those rhetorical strategies along with the logos of the Earth's energy balance, which is ultimately very logical, it makes sense, then the communicative value is strengthened, yeah, through the rhetorical triangle. So here's an example. I'm a little scared to even bring this up because it's such an incredibly sensitive topic, but from a communications perspective, the controversy around vaccines. My understanding is that there was one scientific study in 1998 that made a connection between the MMR vaccine and autism, and that study was later retracted. Is that correct, Wendy?
Yes, it took a few years, but it was eventually retracted.
Okay, so how does one study create 20 years of misperception about this connection? Yeah, to an extent that we're now having a mumps outbreak in Hawaii. You know, not to get into the issue, but this is, we actually use this example in our class because it's very similar in terms of how we're able to engage with science. We can't think clearly about vaccines and autism. How did this happen? Well, I compare it to the game rock, paper, scissors, or we call it in Hawaii, John Kempo. The pathos of one child with autism is so strong that a scientific expert could present. It's so much stronger than that one paper was taken back in 1998. Yeah, that pathos overrides the logos. And then the ethos of parents making decisions about their children's health is just so much stronger than any ethos that a scientist could present. So again, it just kind of overweighs, and because of the power of these rhetorical stances, we're unable to see clearly this issue to the point where we don't even want to bring it up because it's become, you know, such a touchy subject. So cognitive science, and then rhetorical concepts, and then lastly, emerging sort of research from social sciences. This idea comes also from the way you think about climate science is so easy to predict based on who you are, based on your socioeconomic status, level of education, where you live, who you live with, and what your hobbies are. Basically, and how you vote, determines what you believe, what you think, feel, know, and do about climate change. So this is a cluster of how people in the United States feel about climate change, and it's almost perfectly correlated with demographics, as I just described. Most people are concerned to some degree, and climate deniers are actually a very tiny, tiny fragment. But this is also very interesting research and speaks to getting students outside of their demographic group and their social belief system. And I think it also speaks to how we might, as educators, engage with that family group, become more involved with community groups, families, church groups, things like that. That's where students get their knowledge, information, and beliefs. So I'm just going to go through some strategies. You may be reading this climate communication stuff on your own, but we may not have thought about how it translates into the classroom. You know, so for example, what if all of us just agreed that we would not accept what I call green rhetoric? And this is the conclusion paragraph that says, if we all work together and pitch in, we can save the earth one plastic bottle at a time. You know, I literally cross that out and I hand it back and tell me how you really feel about this very important issue. We just cannot accept this type of green rhetoric. Climate communication tells us not to rely on children, future, or the earth as rhetorical strategies. They're too abstract and too far away. We would like our thinking to be 7th-generation thinking, but that's where our problem lies. So we don't want to base our communications around doing it for the children. Any visuals that we use should be concrete and related to data. No clip art, none of the stuff on this page, right? No polar bears, just no more polar bears, right? That's what Naomi Klein says. The polar bears just aren't doing it for me. So for an example of what a suggestion like that might mean, this is a flyer that I was asked to review, and the image at the top, the map with the ocean temperature data in there, was a clip art of a melting globe. And I said, you know, it's not melting actually. Can we use something that actually means something? So I got them to replace that clip art with this data infographic that at least has meaning. but they refused to take the tree growing out of a book off the flyer. So I don't know what that means because trees don't grow out of books, but that's another strategy. Using facts. When students say Waikiki will be underwater or the planet is melting, we need to be repeating specific facts, whatever they might be in your location. 2 feet of sea level rise by the year 2020, or whatever number is most compelling for you in your area. Specific impacts. Wendy taught me, like when I first met her early on, she told me that scientists no longer engage in debate.
Well, we never really did. So this is something that comes from the social sciences, and they often want to have a debate about a topic, but science doesn't work by who wins a debate per se. It's based on the preponderance of evidence.
This is another reason we should be working together across the disciplines, because I can tell you that there are lots of courses that are having students write papers on both, air quotes here, sides of this conversation, and there are no sides. There is the climate science and there's the solutions and what we're going to do. You guys may or may not know that the term climate denier actually is no longer accepted by the American Psychological Association. So in the style manual, which is what we teach in English courses, the correct term is those who reject mainstream climate science. And I think that's just about the most radical thing that the APA style book could ever do. So little things like that. Always using 2 rhetorical strategies, taking the time to assess prior knowledge so that you can be careful that you don't reinforce erroneous knowledge. Connecting to measurable actions and working with social connectors. Who are the important people in a student's life, and how can that person become part of an emerging understanding about climate science? For students, what I tried to observe with Wendy's classes is that students need to get that clear, consistent explanation of the Earth's energy balance. That is the best description of what's happening with the science.
And that often takes practice. So that's an important part of the science, is that by communicating, you actually are learning the science, and practicing is how you get to your clear and consistent explanation.
Right. I encourage students to choose 3 or 5 clear facts that they can understand and not feel responsible for the whole topic of conversation, but to know deeply the one thing they care the most about, whether it's coral or beaches or animals or human impacts. Pick one thing and understand clear facts that you can repeat. What the National Council for Science and the Environment recommends is that we each develop a consistent message delivered frequently by a trusted messenger. This is a framing worksheet that I made for our class. I'd be happy to share it with anyone. And the little sentences here inside frame letters here, A through G, right? Just as an exercise to help students prepare their own communication. And this could be done at any level. What are they going to contribute to a conversation about climate change? How can they pick a few of these things and frame what they want to contribute in conversations?
And this is an activity that Krista pulled out of the Northwest Earth Island Institute, the SMART, kind of having students go through the SMART list, being specific, being measurable, attainable, results-oriented, and targeted. And this is a really good example of where students really need to make the connection between what they say and that global energy balance model. So one of the things we would have students do is if they start talking about cutting their home energy usage by 25%, they really need to connect that back to the Earth's energy balance, to the carbon cycle. How is that going to change the inputs? Is that going to cause, will we cause a positive or negative forcing of the model? Is that going to result in temperatures going up or down? And so it's really a good tool for students to kind of make those connections all the way through.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. We have one more slide? Yeah. Oh, this is our resource slide. Some of the things that we mentioned over the course of today's conversation. And I think with this, we are ready to run the last question. We said we were going to talk about some of the problems we had with our course, but then it was so much fun to talk about that we didn't want to. But
we'll ask you yours.
Yeah, so we'll ask you what problems you have. Our last question, Bruce, if you can, obstacles that you all face in teaching climate effectively. And then we'll go right into the Q&A if that's okay with you, Bruce.
Fine with me. Okay, our poll is up. As we see, what obstacle or obstacles prevent you from teaching climate change effectively? Please choose your top 3 answers and select all that apply. We'll give everybody just about a minute or so. And, you know, hopefully you're one of the folks that doesn't have to answer this question.
These challenges can also be logistical, which is some of what Krista and I ran into.
One of my current rants is about workload issues. When I look at a community college classroom and Wendy's workload in particular, we teach a 5-4 teaching load, which means we teach 5 courses in the fall and 4 courses in the spring. This is a very, very high teaching load, and someone like Wendy is going to have multiple preps, and what really gets me is that her classroom is designed, the classroom and what she's supposed to cover is designed to have 35 students, which would be okay if she was doing a lecture every day, a midterm, and a final that were graded by a bubble exam. But if science teachers are teaching the way research tells us we need to be teaching, then that's a mismatch with the conditions under which the teacher is working. So it really, I feel like we say, oh, change everything about the way you teach except for the conditions under which you're teaching, right? The class size, period, the classroom, and the number of classes is, I think, the biggest barrier to Wendy being the amazing teacher that she is. I see how much it takes out of Wendy and other science educators. They're going above and beyond in order to be excellent climate teachers.
And we also just ran into logistical challenges in terms of scheduling learning communities, right? So there's a lot of support for the idea of a learning community until it comes down to being in 2 different departments with 2 different department chairs and 2 different scheduling agendas, and that can take a lot of finessing to work out, but it's worth it if it can be done.
Okay, well, we've closed the poll and I've posted the results, and in fact, as you may have guessed, 59% of our respondents noted that time workload is in fact one of the largest obstacles. Coming in second is that the subject overwhelms the students. Third is that they don't know appropriate ways to teach climate change effectively. And then with the fourth is opposition or lack of support from administration, colleagues, or others. And finally, they don't know enough about the science. Just one more note that one of our long-term participants wrote down, another obstacle being that their state standards don't fully support climate science. And before I take another breath, I want to note that a number of our participants wrote in asking how you actually sort of went over and above and sort of met to some degree your time workload issues and any recommendations that you might have. Like, for instance, joining Climate Stewards.
Well, initially in our first year, we had a small support, which allowed one of us, me, to take some what we call release time here at my college. So it was teaching one less class. And it was really valuable because what that meant is I was able to attend all of Krista's classes and vice versa. So we actually felt the learning community worked the best when we were both physically present. The second time we tried it, we didn't have that luxury, and so we ran them as kind of two separate classes with a parallel kind of agenda and trajectory, but we do think that the first one worked the best. Mm-hmm. There's actually a reason we're not teaching it this fall, because we're trying to regroup and see the best way to get us back to the way we liked it.
I think that the value of assessing those bar charts from the SALG, the Student Assessment of Learning Gains, and the fact that we were really able to show, look, when we did it this way, we got these learning gains, we got these type of results, is really important. And studies like the one that was presented last week about educational interventions and their impact, I think it's really important that we start taking this conversation to administrators, to faculty unions, to school boards, parents. You know, how do we think differently rather than just trying to work harder, stay up later at night, make our lesson plans, you know, better, do more conferences with students instead of doing more. How can we push on some different points? As an English teacher, I feel like I have more flexibility. I need something for students to write about, and this is all great material for writing and critical thinking. There is nothing better than climate change and sustainability for critical thinking. So for me, I am much more flexible. And a lot of humanities, social science people have a little more flexibility. They have less issue of coverage in the curriculum, perhaps. That might not be the case in a K-12 type situation. But that's where partnering across the disciplines, with or without an actual learning community, can really help. And that's also where partnering with informal educators through service learning, or other ways of bringing in, you know, your nature center people. Those are amazing assets. How can we use teachers from other disciplines and teachers from outside of our schools to support our science, the endeavors of our science faculty, make it a little easier by working together, synergizing.
I was just going to add that I think another way to sell it is really through the lens of professional development, because I think both of us learned quite a bit about expanding our own disciplines through the learning community opportunity. So as Krista mentioned, I revisited the things like the rhetorical triangle and have included that even to some degree in the course without Krista as a instructor, but I think too your science became a little more rigorous in terms of your understanding of climate change and being able to explain it. You know, I think through the lens of professional development, it's also a way we can move learning communities back into the teaching landscape, hopefully. Any more questions, Bruce?
Oh yeah, we've got more than a few.
We're not seeing them, so.
Right. So yeah, I just wanted to give you some time to answer that. In addition to these resources, by the way, that Krista and Wendy have presented on the screen, I have additional resources that have been mentioned during their talks in some slides afterwards, in addition to some other announcements for those of you who came a little bit late. One of our attendees mentions, did the learning gains that you received translate into permanent behavior change or action? I mean, has there been any study in this area? Of course, learning is the first step to such change. And by the way, for anyone else, please at this time feel free to type any questions that you have into your question boxes, and we'll get to them shortly.
I don't think we haven't had the opportunity to do kind of a formal assessment. Informally, many of those students, because of our first time doing this in fall of 2015, many of them are still with us now, finishing up as sophomores or getting ready to transfer as kind of pre-transfer juniors. And so for the ones that we do see on a regular basis, I think they all, every time they see me, they start talking about climate change, which is just kind of an interesting thing as I walk around campus. And several of them have become involved with our clubs here on campus. And, you know, I don't think I'd be actually a great study to kind of follow up with them now, 2 years later.
We have another question, which is asking about whether or not you would analyze the student models that you mentioned during the course. You mentioned that they were collected at various points in time.
Yes, so the students kind of refine them over the course of the semester. We worked very hard for 2 or 3 weeks, and then on one of their first exams, they actually have to replicate one from memory. And it was an interesting comparison because I have done this in standalone environmental science classes, and they did come out better in the learning community course. It's a little hard for me to say because we also emphasized it a little more in the learning community, but they scored very high on being able to replicate it from memory. Again, it was the idea if you have that memorized tool, then you can kind of pull that out of your toolkit and use it in a conversation or in an explanation in a written aspect on climate change.
Thanks. You know, we got one question here from an individual who actually engages in professional development with educators, and she asks if you could recommend how to reach out and reach English teachers or professors regarding climate change.
That is a really great question. I started attending the Association for Environmental Studies and Sciences. It's a meeting of mainly environmental studies teachers. The first time I went, I actually went with Wendy, and I got hooked because that's really where this interdisciplinary conversation is, I think, beginning. How to reach out to them. Well, a learning communities initiative would just be awesome. I'm looking at how to help scientists find that buddy for the purposes of doing presentations. You could start with guest lecturers, inviting a science teacher into an English class, maybe co-sponsoring a film, and leading a discussion afterwards with a humanities scholar or an artist and a climate scientist. Coming up October 9 through 15 is Climate Education Week. So there's kind of an opportunity there to do something like a film with a panel of 3 different teachers talking about it from their perspective. Another huge project that I work on is a sustainability designation project. This would apply in higher education, but finding teachers who teach writing courses, psychology, art, social science, psychology, economics, I can go on and on. Finding those teachers and give their course a sustainability designation. This is another project that we've done, I think, incredibly successfully across the University of Hawaii system to give those teachers who are having students write these research papers about climate change, let them kind of raise their hand and say, oh, I want a sustainability designation on my course, and then that draws them into this peer-to-peer professional development conversation where they get to engage with science faculty. So that's another project that I work on that I'd be happy to talk with anybody about.
And in case anyone is wondering, of course, both Dr. Kaiser and Dr. Kuntz's bios and email addresses are located in the Google archive website, the NOAA Climate Stewards Google website archive website that I gave out information about at the beginning of this broadcast, as well as copies of this presentation, which you can view and download from that site. Another question that we have is from a viewer, and they ask if you could describe the balance between a message of hope and statistics slash FAQs. So, for example, there will be more plastic than fish by 2050, or the ocean will be out of seafood in 30 years. This person mentions that they work in the nonprofit sector and see green rhetoric used frequently, for example, saving one bottle or one straw at a time. If you could give access or more examples that might be more effective.
This is always one of the toughest things for any educator, but we face this in environmental science, and you want to also avoid what sometimes in environmental science teaching is called issue fatigue. And I think one of the ways is really in the science behind the topic, and this is where I'll go back to that Earth's energy balance or understanding the carbon cycle, is when students get a deep understanding of that aspect, instead of then me giving them solutions, they have to derive solutions using that science. And it's a tough situation we're in, so it's never going to be straightforward. But once they start seeing that there are things you can do to mitigate the amount of carbon dioxide being emitted to the atmosphere, and that will have consequences in terms of global temperatures or what's called a negative forcing, those become much more realistic, right? And so this is where I kind of said under that smart balance, when students tell us or tell me we are going to eat more local food, then they have to make that connection. Well, how does that really, to avoid it just being a greenwashing situation, how does that connect? And then they have to go through the costs. If I don't have to ship it to Hawaii, then that is going to mean less CO2, and then that's going to result in a climate forcing rather than a negative forcing, rather than what we call positive forcing, which is an increase in the temperature. Mm-hmm. So if they can kind of go through all of those steps, it becomes, for a lot of students, otherwise they don't make that connection. And then they kind of drop off, well, why is it even important? Really doesn't make a difference. But it's a tough one. Ocean pollution is even harder, I think. But, again, it's going back to where's the source? How do we reduce at the source? A lot of the data shows that ocean plastics are coming from actually terrestrial sources being washed into oceans. And so how do you, mitigate there?
Mm-hmm. I think it maybe sounds obvious, but we have to be more visible about what we are doing. What's overwhelming is students are like, why should I use plastic when I see it all over the place? It's that cognitive dissonance when we don't see others doing it. So if we shift our gaze to, organizations like NOAA and people who are starting nonprofits and businesses and, find, it sounds obvious, it sounds cliche, but we don't make those solutions as visible as we could.
Yeah, I'm also going to put another plug in for service learning, and we kind of didn't go as deep into that because you can spend a whole webinar about what service learning is, but that's this pedagogy where students are interacting in the community and making, real differences. And even if they're small, like we have students that work with a program here that does beach cleanups, they start to actually count and catalog the type of plastics. They can make some suggestions like, wow, 50% of the trash is from cigarette butts, mm-hmm. So then they can start thinking about how it makes more sense to focus on smokers and how do we get them to make sure that their cigarettes are disposed of properly. We've had students go through this in some of the classes, which is why I'm pulling that example out. But the service learning aspect really is one of the ways that you can kind of go away from the gloom and doom to kind of how can you make a positive impact in your own community.
Yeah, how do you become a change agent? You want students to meet other change agents and have this transformative moment, this like aha moment, and it's kind of like the more you go into it, the more it unfolds, and there's so much positive energy, I think, in this generation and in students who are working for change. So connect them into that change community, I think, is the best thing that we do for them.
Any more questions?
I haven't seen any specific questions come up recently, but I tell you what, if folks are thinking of them, what I'd like to do at the moment is I'd like to actually go to my own, back to my own presentation from my own slides. There are a number of additional resources that we have for folks, that some of which you had mentioned. Actually, the Climate Generation group, which is based out of Minnesota, is a tremendous group. I've put the link there to their climate change and energy curricula, and just below that is a link if you would like to join their Teach Climate Network and book club. It's a tremendous book club. The folks who run it are terrific. If you're, again, interested in finding out more about Cli-Fi or books of that nature, I recommend actually you can certainly join into our own book club by signing up to our email list. In addition, a number of the subjects that have been talked about today, we have gone into more detail already through NOAA Climate Stewards in some of our webinar archives, and you can see the link to get to there. That's on our public site, such as making climate communication stick, looking at framing, looking at students' misconceptions and conceptual change, connectedness of the climate system. The last webinar that was mentioned by Dr. Martha Monroe, Climate Education, What Works. I put the link in here, as well as turning misinformation into educational opportunities. That was actually a wonderful presentation, which was how to address individuals who are skeptical regarding climate science. And finally, for those who are teaching in elementary, at the elementary level, we have a webinar which focuses on sharing the climate story with young learners through Elementary Globe. So all of these I will recommend to you, to everyone who's here. And you know what, I just want to finish up with a couple of announcements, and then I will end the recording and we can go back to taking more questions from Dr. Heiser and Dr. Kuntz. And those are to please check your email. If you've registered for this webinar, you've received a link to our post-webinar poll. So if you would go and complete it right after we're done with this broadcast, you would make all of us at NOAA Climate Stewards very happy. Again, save the dates for our next webinar, Monday, November 6th at 7:30 p.m. We have Dr. Mark Eakin, Director of NOAA's Coral Reef Watch program. The focus of his talk is going to be Chasing Coral, the impact of warming seas on coral ecosystems. And on Monday, November 27th at 8 p.m. Eastern Time, we have our next Climate Stewards book meeting, Braiding Sweetgrass, Indigenous Wisdom, Scientific Knowledge, and Teachings of Plants. If you'd like to join the discussion group or find out more about Cli-Fi and some of the books we've read, you can get in touch with Peg Steffen at NOAA.gov. And for those of you who came in late, our announcement that NOAA Climate Stewards later on this month is becoming NOAA Planet Stewards. And if you are already signed up to our email list, no worries, you will continue to find out information about Planet Stewards. If you have not yet, you can sign up today, either going to type in this link on your browser or going to the NOAA Climate Stewards website and just signing up for our regular email list. The focus of NOAA Planet Stewards will be to expand our purview, looking at the range of environmental impacts on human communities and on environments and ecosystems that NOAA monitors. So much broader than only climate. We'll also be looking at things like marine debris, non-point source pollution, extreme weather events and safety. And you'll want to sign up so you can stay informed about all our programming opportunities, including our 2018 Stewardship Community Application, where you could receive up to $2,500 for a classroom, school, or community project. All formal and informal educators who work with students ranging from elementary through college and even the public are, it's available for you. Also find out more about our webinars, book club meetings, and workshops, and lots of PD opportunities and educational resources. And for my final slide, I have this wonderful image of the EEV, a species which is found only in Hawaii. It's restricted to high elevation forests due to, unfortunately, introduced diseases, and it is now on the endangered species list. I believe, Wendy, that this was a bird that you studied?
Yes, this was the bird I did my dissertation on, and it was just announced as listed as a threatened species by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service just about 2 weeks ago. The announcement was made.
Oh.
And in part because of climate change. As the climate warms, mosquitoes are moving upslope, and this bird will be even more threatened by introduced diseases.
Oh, I am.
But it's beautiful and it's doing well. So the good news is it's good now on the list because it means we'll be paying attention. And that means people this is the kind of thing where my students go out and we plant trees in high elevation forests to try and increase, working with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and the national refuges to create more habitat for these guys.
Excellent. And by the way, although we're not going to be going away, I'm just going to be ending the recording, but to end the recording, I would like to thank both of you for taking a lot of time out of your busy schedules to join us here, even though you have about a bit more of your day left out there on the island of Hawaii, where my day is coming to a close. I'd like to thank you for joining us here today and offering your presentation to the NOAA Climate Stewards education community. And I'd like to thank everyone who has attended this broadcast for joining us and asking such wonderful questions. We're not going to stop with the questions. We're just going to stop the recording now. So thanks very much. I look forward to seeing you all soon.